Did you know that for a time, official U.S. maps, well, they didn't even show Hawaii?
That's right, even when it was a U.S. territory. And crucially, even after it was attacked.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Why would that happen? And I suppose, what does it tell us about how we even define the United States?
Exactly.
Today, we're exploring this idea of a greater United States. It's a concept that goes way beyond that familiar map, the logo map everyone pictures.
The lower 48, basically.
Right. We'll be looking at Daniel Immerwahr's book, How to Hide an Empire, to sort of unpack how the U.S. has historically seen and maybe even hidden its territories.
It's a really compelling argument he makes.
So as you're listening today, maybe keep this question in mind. What does it actually mean for a place and for its people to be part of a nation?
That's the core question, really.
And, tackling these hidden histories, understanding narratives, it's something people are exploring in new ways now. There are even channels like Mindful Moments on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. What do?
They use AI for book analysis, actually. It prompts reflection, critical thinking about the stories we get told. Kind of aligns with what we're trying to do here. Unpack something complex, maybe find some surprising truths.
Interesting approach. And Pearl Harbor is such a stark starting point for this whole discussion.
It really is. Immerwahr points out that Roosevelt, in his first draft of that famous speech...
The day of infamous speech.
Yeah. He initially said the bombing happened in Hawaii in the Philippines. But that got changed.
Changed to just Oahu. Just the one Hawaiian island.
So what does that signal? How do the mainland, see these places?
Well, it suggests a difference in perception, maybe even value. Immerwahr looked at polls from the time. There seemed to be less public appetite for defending what were seen as remote territories. The Philippines, for instance, compared to Hawaii.
So it was about crafting a narrative, focusing on an attack on what felt like, America to mainlanders, American island, American lives lost.
It seems that way. Hawaii was pulled into closer focus, while the Philippines, maybe unintentionally, got pushed further away in the national mind.
It just underscores the power of framing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How the stories we tell shape who we think belongs, what territory is truly ours.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture Immerwahr paints, you see how that familial logo map, the contiguous states, it often hid this much larger, more complicated reality, the greater United States.
He even mentions wartime atlases during World War II, listing Hawaii and other territories as foreign.
Imagine that, trying to grasp a global war with maps that don't even fully show your own country's reach. Think about how that would affect understanding the stakes.
It really makes you question the name United States of America itself.
Oh, so?
Well, Immerwahr notes that back in the 19th century, terms like the United States or the Republic or just the Union were much more common.
Right, I've seen that.
The specific phrase United States of America in presidential speeches really only ramps up after 1898.
Post-Spanish-American War, when the overseas territories started coming in.
Exactly. So did acquiring those territories kind of force a name change? Did the old names suddenly feel too small for this expanded nation?
It's a fascinating thought, and this is where Immerwahr argues things get really interesting, particularly around race.
Okay.
He says understanding this greater United States forces us to see how central race has been, but beyond just the black-white dynamic we usually focus on.
You mean including Filipinos, Hawaiians, Samoans?
Precisely. The Chamorro people in Guam, all these groups. Immerwahr connects it back to those polls we mentioned. He suggests a strong racial element.
In what way?
Many white Americans back then seemed to struggle to see non-white people in places like the Philippines as truly American.
And therefore, less worth defending.
That seems to be the implication Immerwahr draws from the sentiment at the time. Race wasn't just shaping lives, it was shaping the very definition of the nation. Where the borders were, who counted as American.
So when you look past that simple logo map, you find all these other struggles over who belongs, over identity happening within the U.S. context.
Absolutely. And this expansion, Immerwahr frames it in sort of 3 acts.
Okay.
First, the familiar story, westward expansion, displacing Native Americans. But he frames the creation of Indian country as arguably the U.S.'s first colony.
That's a provocative way to put it.
It is, but it highlights the territorial control aspect. And what's interesting is how even this known history looks different through that lens, that Indian country, legally defined.
It was often invisible on maps used by white settlers.
Yeah.
And mentally obscure.
Too, pretty much. Often ignored, rarely mapped accurately from their perspective.
Okay, so that's Act 1. What's Act 2?
overseas expansion kicks off just 3 years after that logo map really solidifies. You get Alaska.
Right.
Then the Spanish-American War spoils the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, plus Hawaii, Wake Island, American Samoa, later the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Wow, it happened fast.
Very fast. By World War II, these territories were a huge part of this greater United States, geographically speaking.
And it wasn't always some grand strategic plan, was it? You mentioned the Guano Islands Act.
Oh, the Guano Islands Act of 1856. It's almost unbelievable. It basically let any U.S. citizen who found bird droppings guano on an unclaimed, uninhabited island.
Let me guess. Claim it for the U.S.
Claim it for the United States. Guano was incredibly valuable as fertilizer back then. It nearly caused wars.
Bird droppings almost starting wars.
Okay. It sounds absurd, but it shows how the greater United States wasn't always meticulously planned. It grew in these sometimes surprising, almost accidental ways.
Just individuals annexing islands. That's wild.
By 1902, Immerwahr says the U.S. had 94 of these guano islands. It feeds into that expansionist mindset, Walt Whitman declaring, "The Pacific will be ours."
Even while many people back on the mainland had no clue how big the U.S. actually was.
Exactly. That disconnect is crucial. And, circling back to resources that help us think critically about these hidden histories, like mindful moments or discussions like ours, they push us to see beyond the simple narratives.
It really highlights a tension, doesn't it? Expansion is happening, but there's this gap between the mainland view and the reality in the territories.
A huge gap. Immerwahr cites a government report during WWII that found many Americans, even educated ones, knew next to nothing about these overseas possessions.
They were surprised the U.S. even had an empire.
Profoundly surprised, apparently. That confusion is key. The logo map, while simple and convenient,
it kind of created a national amnesia about a huge part of the country and its history.
That's a good way to put it, national amnesia. And when you start thinking about this hidden empire, it really can reshape how you see major historical events.
Absolutely. Like World War II. Roosevelt framed it as an attack on the United States, right? But it began in these territories.
The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hawaii, understanding they were part of the U.S., part of this greater United States, gives crucial context that's often missing.
Yeah, the standard narrative often skips that nuance.
So we've seen how that familiar map has, hidden this larger, more complex reality, this greater United States, this network of territories. Its history is deeply intertwined with the mainland's.
And often overlooked.
Definitely. So thinking about the implications, how does knowing about this hidden empire change how you see something like World War II? Or even how you think about America's role in the world today?
It adds layers, for sure. The story of how the U.S. drew its borders, decided who was in or out, it's full of these unexpected turns, and the consequences were and are really profound.
It's a story that's still unfolding in many ways. We really encourage listeners to keep exploring these ideas. Maybe check out resources like Mindful Moments for that kind of in-depth analysis that sparks critical thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And if this discussion has broadened your understanding, maybe made you think a bit differently, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone else who might find it interesting.
We'll have links to Immerwahr's book, How to Hide an Empire, and other relevant stuff in the show notes if you want to dig deeper.
Ultimately, our goal here is just to encourage that critical thinking about the world, the stories we tell ourselves, and maybe questioning the maps we take for granted.